Macros, an automated sequence of instructions applied to geometry files. This series of videos includes an introduction to macros with this video, using macros in EDM electrode manufacture, boundary and surface independent macros, and drilling data independent macros. A macro is an automated sequence of instructions you can apply to geometry files or to active items in your folder view. Macros contain all the instructions needed to complete a process, but not the geometry or surface data. Therefore, they always need a geometry file as input. For example, you can use a macro to automate a complete project through the roughing, semi-finishing and finishing stages, or an individual strategy or a group of strategies. Macros are saved with the .mco file extension and are created either automatically by NCG CAM to record all operations, or manually using the file menu to record the operations you choose. Macros are created automatically by NCG CAM every time a process is added to a database. In the event of a system crash or failure, the saved macro can be used to restore all of the processes carried out in the previous session. The macro, by default, is saved to the system's temp directory. The user can, if desired, select a different folder for the NCG CAM temporary file via Tools, Options, General. Here we can see the backup macro in the temporary directory. There are two ways for the user to manually save processes as a macro. First method, you can set up and create all the processes you require using the dialogues to create the passes, link the passes, set the parameters, and post-process. These can be edited and modified in the usual way. Processes can then be selected from the folder view and then saved as a macro from the file menu. Alternatively, using the second method, you can select the completed processes from the Process Manager. Right-click and choose Save as Macro from the shortcut menu. All the processes on which the active process depends are saved as part of the macro. For example, if the core roughing linking plan is saved as part of the macro, the core roughing passes, the boundaries, triangulated surfaces, and all other items used for the calculations are also saved. The information is saved in a text file. These files are relatively small because the information that is recorded are only the settings that differ from the defaults. Let's have a look at the dialog for saving a macro. Select the process folder or folders that you want to record. Then click File, Macro, Save As. The Save As dialog box opens. In the file name box, type the name for the macro. Select the following options from the display list. This will control the display of the dialog boxes during the running of the macro. No dialogues. This runs the macro from start to finish without opening any dialog boxes. File open dialogues only. This is the default. This runs the macro and displays the open dialog box when an input geometry file is required. When the dialog box opens, the macro is paused. Select a geometry file to open and click OK to continue the macro. Dialogs from boundaries only. This runs the macro and displays the dialog boxes for all plans which have a 2D boundary as input. Each time the dialog box opens, the macro is paused. Change any values you require and click OK to continue the macro. All dialogs. This runs the macro and opens all the dialog boxes that are recorded in it, regardless of whether they are relevant for a particular application. You have maximum control over the settings of all processes, but the system is unable to run unsupervised. Select one of the following options from the On Completion list. Do Nothing, the default, Save, Close, Close and Save. Click Save to save your macro for later use. More options in the Save As dialog. Set the display option to No Dialogs. Click the Surface Independent box to apply the saved macro to run on alternative geometry files. The Project Settings option can be unchecked, as the alternative geometry file should first be opened in NCG CAM, which would automatically open a Project Settings dialog. The macro can be selected and run from the File menu. Clicking the Boundary Independent box to apply the saved macro to geometry files with active surfaces and boundaries. Selecting this option forces the Surface Independent box to be checked. There are two methods to implement this functionality. First, if only a single boundary is to be used, then its name in the host and target databases is unimportant. Second, if more than one boundary is to be used, then the naming of the boundaries in both databases needs to be identical. Note, this option is not available when the display list is set to File Open Dialogs only. Click Drilling to apply the saved macro to drilling data in the target database. In this case, the macro reads the surfaces from the inputs to the drilling data. The macro will select the drilling data folders by name, using the name of the first drilling data in each cycle plan. Click the Project Settings box to open the Project Settings dialog when you run the macro. Clear the box if a database opens when you run the macro and you do not want to change the project settings. Click the Save Folder Names box to include the names of all the objects in the tree view in the saved macro. If this is not ticked, then the new objects will have their default names when the macro is run. Click the Allow Empty Toolpaths box to allow empty toolpaths in post-processor plans. If this is not ticked, then any empty toolpaths will cause post-processor plans to fail when the macro is run.